and the ideas and arts of the Renaissance. And basically, we are going to see what they were transmitting in matters of knowledge. Bautista, is this because you want to say something?
What do you mean?
Yeah, you are raising your hand. No?
Teacher, I think it's a mistake. Like, I don't know, he already took it out.
Yeah, I did. I don't remember doing that.
Okay, okay. Well, let's start. Bautista, can you read the introduction, please?
Yes. General introduction. During the Renaissance, humanism revived interest in the literary works
Sorry, there. Sorry.
of ancient Greece and Rome and in classical Latin. While many scholars use classical Latin, writers such as Dante and Chaucer made literature written in regional languages more popular. Humanism also became an educational curriculum, and at the core of humanist schools were the liberal studies. The arts, sculpture, and architecture of the Renaissance reflected a realistic, human centered world.
Yeah, look, this is the most important thing here. I think, in my opinion, the last sentence. The art, sculpture, and architecture of the Renaissance reflected a realistic, human centered world. Because in the Middle Ages, remember that the center of everything was religion, right? And the church, and the power of the church, and the figure of the Pope, and everything was around being a good Christian. Now, the humans were the center of the world or of the universe, as a like this as a perspective, right? For for getting knowledge, right? And we call this humanism. The the knowledge is centered on humans, right? Humanism. Um, that was the core of humanist schools. It was a liberal studies because you had some freedom to study something, right? And because in the past there was no freedom, and then the church and the Bible were considered the only truth, right? But now it was more open, more liberal, right? Whereas what else? Latin was the official language, and look, since Latin was the official language, not a lot of people could read and write, and because it was more complicated, and they had to. One thing was to speak Latin, and another was to speak the vernacular, which was like the common language. So, and I mean, those days, if you went to the church on a Sunday, you didn't understand what the priest was saying because it was in Latin. So it was like this, and we're going to see some changes here. So the idea is to learn about the ideas and art of the Renaissance, right? Mario, can you read this paragraph, please?
Italian Renaissance humanism. Secular and emphasis on the individual characterize the Renaissance. The characteristics are most noticeable in the intellectual and artistic accomplishments of the period. A key intellectual movement of a Renaissance was humanism.
Yeah, right. So here the word is humanism. This intellectual movement that happens in the Renaissance, um, and it was characterized by an emphasis on the individual, right, on the person. That's why we have great artists in these times in the Renaissance, and secularism, things that correspond to this world, not the spiritual world, right? And that is humanism. And intellectual movement, which emphasis was on the person and the world's, sorry, yes, and the things of this world, basically, right? Thank you, Mario. Vale?
Yes, humanism was based on the study of the classics, the literal works of ancient Greek and Rome. Humanists studied grammar, rhetoric, poetry, moral philosophy, and history. Today, these subjects are called humanities.
Yes. Social studies is part of the subject, I mean, like the complete field of knowledge that we call humanities, right? And grammar also. That's why in language arts, you also see stories and tales and all kinds of writing, right? And what else? What else? Philosophy. Well, you are going to see some philosophy in Perepa, I guess. Well, yes, poetry, moral. All these are considered the subjects of humanities, right? Because basically they are centered on the person, on what the people used to do, like social studies, work history. Thank you so much, Vale. Dante, Petrarch.
Yes, Petrarch, who often has been called the father of Italian Renaissance humanism, did more than any other individual in the 14th century to foster the development of humanism. Petrarch looked for forgotten Latin manuscripts and set in a motion to search for similar manuscripts in monastic libraries through Europe. He also began the humanist emphasis on using pure classical Latin, Latin as used by the ancient Romans as opposed to the medieval Latin. Humanists use the work of Cicero as a model for the prose
Or prose.
and those of Virgil for poetry.
Yeah. Okay, so, guys, if we mention humanism in the Renaissance, we have to mention Petrarch. He was one of the first supporters, and he was one of the first one to uh, to retake the manuscripts from the libraries that were in Latin from Romans like Cicero and Virgil, um, which were writers and members of they were patricians, right? He was one of the first persons to support all this movement, right? Petrarch. Right. Very good. Thank you, Dante. Fernando.
The teacher. 14th century humanists like the Petrarch had described the intellectual life as one of solitude. They rejected family and life of action in the community. In contrast, humanists in the early
100s.
1400s took a new interest in civic life. They believed that intellectuals had a duty to live an active civic life and to put their study of humanities to the state's service. It is no accident that they serve as secretaries in the Italian city-states and provinces or popes.
Yeah, look, at first, in the 14th century, Petrarch said that to be a humanism was to work alone, to live apart from society, and not to have family, like to be single all the time, uh, and these kind of intellectuals, right? But later, that idea changed. Now they believe that if you were an intellectual, and you should be working for the government, and that's why they started to get in touch with the aristocrats and with princes and popes as secretaries in the city states. I remember that some of the city states that were very important were Venice, Florence, Milan, all these places, right? And we are also focused on these places, and this was a change from solitude to live a civic life, like more in community, right? Okay, and now, what is vernacular? Let's see this concept, please, Regina.
Humanist emphasis on a classical Latin led to its widespread use in the writings of scholars, lawyers, and theologians. However, some writers wrote in the vernacular, the language spoken in their own regions, such as Italian, French, or German. In the 14th century, the literary works of the Italian author Dante and the English author Geoffrey
how to help make vernacular literature more popular.
Yes, Dante. Dante.
Mande.
And do you know if you got your name because of Dante Alighieri?
Yeah, Dante Alighieri appears. I know. He's super ugly. I don't relate.
But he rewrote one of the masterpieces of human history.
Ah, yes, I have read it before.
Yeah,
The
right.
Divine Comedy.
Yes, yes, the divine. Well, he was one of the first writers who used the vernacular, that is the language that was spoken in the regions, like Italian, French, and German, because everything that was intellectual in that time was made in Latin, right? But now these people were changing that so that more people had access to more knowledge, right? And that's why we have this movement of humanism as more intellectuals learning things, right? And we saw.
Teacher, that name spelled wrong. Like my name is not Dante. My name is Dante
I know,
with an E.
I know. This is
Yes, but like
the
English people, like in America, they do say Dante.
say, yeah.
Yeah, and that's wrong. It's Dante.
I know. But here, well, here they mention here that we have to pronounce Dante. Dante.
English is one of the only languages that, how do you say, pronounce a E like a la letra E, like an E, and they're wrong because
Mhm.
they're American. It's Dante. No, so it's not Dante. It's Dante.
Okay. Okay, and this one, and also Chaucer, Geoffrey Chaucer, they were two of the first writers to use vernacular languages, French, German, Italian, to to express their ideas, right? So good. And here we have the Divine Comedy. Marifer, please.
Dante's masterpiece in Italian vernacular is the Divine Comedy. It is a story of the soul's journey to salvation. The lengthy poem has three major sections: hell, purgatory, and heaven or paradise. Dante is led on an imaginary journey through these three realms until he reaches paradise, where he beholds God.
Okay, that wasn't.
Yes, guys, and this is a book that I think if you can read it someday, you should. I have it with I mean with my other books, and I haven't read it. I am so ashamed. I started it, but I haven't finished it. But I'm gonna finish it, and you can discover that many of the ideas that we have about the hell and the heaven and the purgatory were taken from this masterpiece. Look, here we have Dante. He's holding, and before, and the name was on the comedy, but they included the word divine later. Heaven, the purgatory, and the hell. Okay, who's gonna read these two paragraphs? Let me see. Camila, please.
Yes, teacher. Which part?
What is here on the side when Dante Alighieri wrote the Divine Comedy?
When Dante Alighieri wrote the Divine Comedy in the early 14th century, he chose the ancient Roman poet Virgil as his guide for the soul's journey to paradise. By doing so, Dante hoped to lend legitimacy to a work written in the dialect of Florence. Dante later defended his use of vernacular in a treatise he wrote in Latin, the language of literature at the time, because he wanted it to be taken seriously. Dante called his masterpiece comedy. The adjective divine was added later, partly because of the poem's religious subject and partly in recognition of its greatness. It soon became a classic, helping to make the Florentine dialect the literary language of the entire Italian peninsula.
Yeah. Okay. This is some information about the Divine Comedy and Dante Alighieri. Very good. Thank you. Who else wants to read? I don't have more people who wants to read here in the chat. Somebody? those who haven't read?
I can read, teacher.
Thank you, Alita.
Chaucer used the English vernacular in his famous work, The Canterbury Tales. His beauty of expression and clear language were important in making his dialect the chief ancestor of the modern English language. The Canterbury Tales consist of a collection of stories told by a group of 29 pilgrims journeying to the tomb of St. Thomas a Becket at Canterbury, England. This format gave Chaucer the chance to portray an entire range of English society.
Yes, I remember that Saint Thomas Becket was a bishop that was killed in 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 the Canterbury, what was it? Cathedral, right? And these tales are about some pilgrims that are going to visit his tomb, right? And it's important because it is like the base of a modern English language. So if you want to know something like this, read this book. It must be amazing, and it is really really famous. Since I was a little kid, I used to listen to the name of this book. Okay, thank you, Bautista. Can you read this slide? Oh, this slide is nice for women. It's
Yes, I can read.
really cool.
Another writer who used the vernacular was Christine de Pizan, a French woman who is best known for her works written in defense of women. In the Book of the City of Ladies, written in 1404, she denounced the many male writers who had argued that women, by their very nature, are unable to learn. Women, de Pizan argued, could learn as well as men if they could attend the same schools.
Can you imagine this? In those times, everyone believed that women couldn't learn just because they were women. By their nature, you're a woman, you're full, you cannot learn. These were the ideas of men in those times. Women, the place of women in history has always been so unbearable, so sad. And this was the same in the Middle Ages. Right? I listened to what she wrote and see how she defended women, right? She was a feminist, and one of the first feminists. And who wants to read this one is the last slide.
Can I read it, teacher?
Yes, Natalia? This is something that she actually wrote. Okay, go ahead.
Should I also tell you whether a woman's nature is clever and quick enough to learn speculative sciences as well as to discover them, and likewise the mathematical sciences? I assure you that women are equally well suited and skilled to carry them out and to put them to sophisticated use once they have learned them.
So, if women had started having more access to formal education, and that was because of the works of women like her, like Christine, right? Because she was defending the idea and the truth that women were as intelligent as men, right? And of course, they couldn't go to school as men for a few more years, right? Well, for many more years, but at least and there was a beginning. That's why we consider the European society more advanced in some ways in the way they see the world, right? In many aspects, not everything, but in many aspects, we consider that. Okay, and this is it. This is today's class, people. Let me stop